Okay, so this week we got to spend time in Genesis 17 through 20. You had, 4 chapters that you had to go through, and it was probably one of the weeks where you had more exciting content to deal with than you were prepared for. You got to have circumcision and the story of Sodom and Gomorrah all in one week, so just hope you enjoyed that. Nice low-key week for you. But I want to make sure that we place this passage within the scope of the broader story. So think about where we're coming from as we get into the text this week. So we came out of a portion of the text where we saw that the covenant was announced to Abram. He's called out of Ur of the Chaldeans. He goes to the land of Canaan. And God says that he is going to give him a land, that he's going to give him descendants, and that through him all the nations would be blessed, and that he will bless those who bless him. And then we saw that immediately upon receiving the covenant news, Abram is tested with famine. There's a famine in the land of Canaan, and in an act of self-reliance, he goes to Egypt. Things don't go well there. He pretends that his wife is his sister, and Pharaoh ends up with a difficult situation and says, "You need to leave," and sends him out with the wealth of Egypt. So we had echoes of the Exodus story. We see again then the covenant brought back into play. It is ratified, so to speak. We saw the parting of the flesh of animals and the smoking fire pot and the flame passing in between those to signify that God was the one who had initiated the covenant and God was the one who would confirm the covenant in faithfulness. Meanwhile, Abram was unconscious, showing exactly the role that every human who has ever been brought into covenant relationship with God has played in making righteousness their own. We are as good as dead, and he brings us to life. And then immediately following that, we saw another scene where self-reliance ruled the day, where Sarai, who has waited at that point for the child promise to come to her, says to her husband, "What if we go with plan B?" And she offers Hagar, her Egyptian servant, to him, and the result is Ishmael. So we've seen this back and forth in the story of trusting and faith, and then wavering into self-reliance. So we pick up the story this week then with Abram and the institution of the covenant of circumcision. And can I just say, there's nothing I like better than talking about circumcision in a women's class. So let's go. Let's jump in. Chapter 17, starting in verse 1, says, "When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, 'I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly.'" So no new news here in terms of what God says, but what do we learn? We learn that Abram is 99 years old. So if you've been paying attention to the age markers that are dropped for us in the story, when he is called out of Ur of the Chaldeans, he was 75. So how many years have passed? Do your math. 24 years, right? He's been waiting for 24 years for that initial covenant message to begin to show itself to be true. Not only that, but since we saw the story of Ishmael and the birth of Ishmael occur, 13 years have passed. 13 years have passed during which Abram has probably believed that plan B just might work. Maybe it is through Ishmael that this can happen. And think about that. He has no children until Ishmael comes on the scene. It is natural for us to assume that in the intervening 13 years, even though God has said that it will not be through Ishmael that his line will come, that he will feel an attachment to the boy. So he's got a 13-year-old by Hagar. Let's see what happens next. It says, "Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, 'Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham.'" So what just happens here with God renaming him? Now, you know the significance of names in the Old Testament. Names were meant to be prophetic. And so the name Abram means father of many. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. Abram, for his entire life, has introduced himself to everyone he meets as father of many. Now, if you're just a person meeting him during the course of the day and he walks up and introduces himself, what is the first question that he was likely to be asked every time he introduced himself? "Hi, I'm John. What's your name?" "Oh, I'm Abram." "Oh, father of many." "Oh, how many children do you have?" Don't you know that Abram had been asked that over and over and over again? And what is his answer? None. I don't have any children. Oh, father of many, how many children do you have? I don't have any. I don't have any. I don't have any. And now look what the Lord does with Abram's name. He says, now your name will be Abraham, which means what? Father of a multitude. How do you think Abraham felt about his name change? Oh, great. Now everywhere I go. Hi, what's your name? Father of a multitude. How many children do you have? This could feel like a cruel joke almost to him, but we've already seen Abraham has a tendency to believe and be credited with righteousness. And so the Lord speaks this name over him. He says, your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. Do you hear the tense of the verb there? It's done. God says, it's done. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you, and I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. But God has a sign that he wants associated with this covenant. And what is it? It's circumcision. And I am guessing that if you are like me, you've had some questions regarding circumcision. Like, what? Of all of the ways that God could have chosen to mark this covenant, why that? Like, it's an awkward topic to even bring up. So as tactfully as I can say it, the reason that every male is marked in their flesh is because the vehicle for begetting needs to bear this sign. The vehicle for begetting, the means by which Abraham will become a great nation, needs to bear a tangible reminder that it is God's faithfulness that brings this about. And so it is marked as a reminder. It's marked as a reminder of original sin, which is passed from father to son. And it's also marked as a warning that those who forsake the covenant would be, as verse 14 will tell us, cut off. And third, it is marked as a promise because the seed of Christ will ultimately come through Abraham's line. And it's an appropriate sign. It's often referred to as a bloody sign. Why? Because the parting of flesh and the shedding of blood are a reenactment of that covenant scene that we already saw where Abram lay unconscious and God placed the covenant in place. So the sign makes sense. And in fact, if you think about what the sign is for the new covenant, which is what? Baptism, right? So you have an unbloody sign for the new covenant. Why? Because there is no longer any need for the shedding of blood, for the remission of sins. The final sacrifice has been made. The covenant is ratified. But it is a bloody sign that we see in the Old Testament, and it is an incredibly personal sign, and God means it to be. So we cleared that up. Let's keep moving. Verse 15. And God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. Now, a couple of things here. Sarah means princess. And then it says, I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. But if you note, there's a little footnote in your Bible that says that an alternate way of reading this is, I have given you a son by her. So again, this sense of, hey, this thing is done. It's done. You don't perceive it to be done, but from God's perspective, it's done. He says, I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of people shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. So there's a couple of things going on here. First of all, Abraham bursts into laughter. Why? Because we're going to see later on in our story where Sarah laughs too. And this is a different kind of laughter. Abraham laughs here, the joyful laughter of the man of faith. This is too good to be true. That is the laughter that we hear coming from Abraham, followed quickly, though, with an underlying sentiment. Oh, plan B could still work, couldn't it? Couldn't we still let Ishmael be the means by which this happens? And how does God respond? In verse 19, he says, "No, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac." Did you notice what Isaac means? He laughs. Now we're going to take our time deciding who the he is in the phrase, he laughs. But we're going to see a laughter theme recur in this story. He says, "I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you." Do you remember what the name Ishmael meant? God hears. Do you see the wordplay that's going on here? "As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year." Okay, that's a news flash, because they've waited for 24 years and not known when this thing would happen. And God just said, this time next year, you're going to be parents. This time next year. Now, what else is going on here with these name changes? Did you notice what was added to each of their names? Abram becomes Abraham, and Sarai becomes Sarah. Do you hear the ha sound that's being added there? Now, if you're familiar with what we talked about in Genesis 1 through 11, we talked about the ruach of God, the spirit or breath of God, the spirit that hovered over the waters at creation, the breath of God that was breathed into the man when he's formed out of the dust, the breath that blew over the face of the earth when the flood waters dried up, the of God. And what do we see here given into the very names of Abraham and Sarah? We see their very plain human names combined with the breath of God. They are enlivened. They are called to his purposes in a pictorial form, even in the way that their names sound. So then we see what we will find to be typical of Abraham. He immediately obeys. He has everyone in his household circumcised, just as God has told him to do. And then we come to a scene where we find another kind of laughter. Genesis 18 says, "And the Lord appeared to him, Abraham, by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth and said, 'O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree, while I bring a morsel of bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant.' So they said, 'Do as you have said.'" So let's pause here before we get a little further into the story and see what's going on. So he's sitting in his tent in the heat of the day, so it's basically siesta. You familiar with that concept? I feel like we need that to come back. Like, I've actually wondered if maybe I'm Latin. I'm not, I'm Irish. But I feel like every afternoon there should be a nap time. And that's what's happening here. And it says that he's by the oaks of Mamre. And this is a significant location because I've told you before that the oaks were the places where the foreign gods were worshipped. Specifically, fertility gods were worshipped in this location. And here we have this whole story, this question of the fertility of the chosen man of God. So he's by his door of his tent in the heat of the day, and he lifts up his eyes, that pattern we've seen, and he sees 3 men coming toward him. And at this stage in the story, we're not exactly sure who the 3 men are, right? And not only that, but we can get a little thrown off because he says, "Oh Lord, if I have found favor in your sight." And we hear Lord and we think, oh, see, he knows it's God. But really, that's just a title of respect that's there. He acknowledges that these are important visitors, but he's not exactly sure who they are. It will become increasingly apparent to him as the story goes on. And he gives this, hey, we're just going to put together, can I bring you a tiny little bit of something to eat and a little something to drink, and you can do a little bit of resting. This is a typical pattern of ancient Near Eastern hospitality, because let's see what he actually does after he sort of undersells this whole thing. Verse 6, it says, and Abraham went quickly into the tent to Sarah and said, quick. Do you hear all the quicklies we're going to hear in here? And he says, 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it and make cakes. So I picture Sarah in the tent at nap time. And Abraham rolls in and he says, just 3 seahs of flour, knead it and make cakes. And could you be fast about it? Now, you probably don't use the measurement of seahs when you get ready to make your home-baked bread. But let me illuminate you. It's probably about 60 quarts of flour. He just told her to bake a whole lot of bread. Verse 7 says, and Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. Okay, but seriously, how quickly? Like, you know how when you're waiting at the restaurant and they don't bring your burger and you're like, because they're out there slaughtering the cow. Because that's the joke, because that would take a really long time. And that's what we're seeing here. Like, sure, maybe it was quickly in their sense of time passing, but I'm like, how long? He's preparing a feast. Verse 8, then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. Why doesn't he sit? He's standing ready to serve. It's a sign of his humility. He has servants, but he himself stands to serve these people. He's a man of means, but he himself stands to serve. So this lavish hospitality that he demonstrates to these 3 visitors. Verse 9, they said to him, where is Sarah, your wife? Do you like how she still is tagged as his wife every opportunity they get? Where is Sarah, your wife? Now, you know who these 3 people are, right? This is a manifestation of God. We don't know exactly how it worked, but we understand that we are to see this as a visit from God himself. Does God not know where Sarah, his wife, is? He knows exactly where Sarah, his wife, is. And so he is doing what he often does. He is inquiring for the purpose of drawing people in. Where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, she is in the tent. Now, have you been camping? What is the worst part about camping? It'd be hard to narrow it down to one thing. But one of the worst things about camping is that you stay in tents, which means you can hear every single thing that's going on in the campground. That's why it's one of the reasons it's so hard to fall asleep at night. So the fact that Sarah is inside the tent means that she can't be seen, but she can hear every single thing that is going on. So we saw that God gave a promise, a specific promise to Abraham in the previous chapter, that this child was going to be their child within a year. But has Sarah heard this from God himself? No. And so in a compassionate move, now we're going to hear God give this promise directly to her. Verse 10, the Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now, Abram and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. Do you like how delicately put that is? What does Moses want us to understand is true? She is no longer able to have a child. She has passed into the twilight years of womanhood, and if there had been some glimmer of hope in the early years, now she doesn't even have the hope of being fertile just on a regular scale of time passing. She has passed into the stage of womanhood where it is no longer even remotely possible that she might carry a child. And imagine how it's felt for the years to pass for her, that her final remaining hope would be removed. It says, so Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? Now, is this the same kind of laughter that we heard out of Abraham? No, this is the laughter of bitterness and hurt. She's devastated. And now you're going to show up and say this to me? Got to be kidding me. Verse 13, the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Uh-oh. See, Sarah was in the tent. I don't know if you were paying attention, but it says she laughed to herself. So she thinks she's having sort of an internal monologue. And then she finds out that God is in fact who Hagar knows God to be, a God who hears and a God who sees. Why did Sarah laugh and say, "Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied it, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. Why was she afraid? Because she realizes who these three men must be. Only God would know that. And he said, "No, but you did laugh." Now, I don't know if you're familiar with stories of people who lie in the scripture and how God responds to it. Do you know the story of Ananias and Sapphira? But what do we see here with Sarah? We see a long-suffering God. We see a God who deals patiently with her in her unbelief, who poses the question that, if we're honest, is the question we all have to come to terms with. Is anything too hard for the Lord? I don't know if you've ever thought about what it would be like to be one of the people who is remembered in Scripture, to be one of the names that shows up in there. Obviously, you don't want to be Ananias and Sapphira. You want to be someone who makes it into the Hebrews Hall of Faith or something like that. But listen to how Abraham and Sarah are spoken of in the Hebrews Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11. It says in verse 11 of Hebrews 11, "By faith Sarah herself received power to conceive even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore." Did you hear it? Abraham was as good as dead. Romans 4:19 in the NIV says this, "Without weakening in his faith, Abraham faced the fact that his body was as good as dead since he was about 100 years old, and that Sarah's womb was also dead." What is the message? Dead, 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 dead. Because God has Abraham and Sarah exactly where he wants them to be, where the only reason that a child could come of this union would be a miraculous one. He intends to display to them and to all who witness the event that he is a God who brings life out of death. Verse 16 says, "Then the men set out from there, and they looked down toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to set them on their way. Then the Lord said, 'Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I have chosen him that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him.'" So do you understand the tension that's being set up here? If there were ever a lesson regarding the wages of sin, it is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so what God is saying is, should I conceal this from Abraham, who's going to need to understand the importance of righteousness, of walking uprightly before me? And the answer is, of course not. This is something he needs to witness. It's going to teach him something of great importance. Verse 20, "Then the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great and their sin is very grave." Did you hear that outcry? God hears. "I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know." Now we have similar language here, God coming down to see what is going on. This is what God did in Eden after Adam and Eve sinned. This is what God did at the Tower of Babel when they were trying to build a name for themselves and a reputation for themselves. He comes down to witness what has happened. Now, is this because God doesn't see when he's in heaven? No, he is all-seeing. He comes down to bear witness so that he can beyond doubt establish the guilt of those he is going to see. God's judgments are perfect, and they are made with every fact in view. This is an important thing for us to understand, because when we are tempted to look at his judgments and call them too harsh, we may be thinking that because our whole experience of going through a legal process where justice is meted out is with a judge who has limited facts and with a jury who have limited facts, and where eyewitnesses don't remember things exactly the way that they happened. But in the Lord of the universe, we have a judge who holds all the facts. He is both judge and jury, and not only that, but he is infinitely wise, and he never judges wrongly. So verse 22, let's see what happens next. So the men turned from there and went towards Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. Then Abraham drew near and said, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" So you can hear his hesitance where he's weighing, should I say something or should I not say something? Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What is the answer to that? No, God would never sweep away the righteous with the wicked. But Abraham is going to have to come to terms with what is going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. So then listen to what Abraham says, verse 24. Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? What is the answer? Yes! Verse 26, and the Lord said, if I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake. Do you hear what God just said? He's like, not only will I not make the righteous perish with the wicked, I won't even make the wicked perish if there are 50 righteous there. And so then what is the response of Abraham? Okay, we have a deal. No, Abraham realizes that it may be a long shot that there are 50. So what does he do? He says, what if there are 45? And God says, for the sake of 45, I will not do it. What if there are 40? Listen, for the sake of 40, I will not do it. What if there are 30? What if there are 20? Abraham goes all the way down to 10. What if there are 10? And God says, listen, if there are 10 there, I will not do it. Now, here is what is not happening. Abraham is not bargaining with God. God knows exactly how many righteous there are in the city. Now, according to one line of theological thought, you could say that there are precisely 0 righteous people in any city. But strictly speaking, he knows that there are 3. There are 3 people that will survive Sodom and Gomorrah. But he's being patient with Abraham. Why? Abraham is learning an important lesson about interceding on behalf of others. He is also going to learn a lesson regarding the severity of sin and the faithfulness of God to eradicate it. Let's look at Genesis 19. It says the 2 angels, so now we know one of the guys is a manifestation of God himself, and then the other 2 are angels of some sort. Doesn't really clear it up for us a whole lot, but we can follow along with the point of the story. The 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was, notice his location, Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. Did you pick up on that in your homework? Let's talk about where Lot came from. Initially, we saw Lot pitch his tent toward Sodom in sight of the city. Then we found that he was actually living in Sodom when he was carried away during battle. And what do we see now? The significance of him sitting at the gate of Sodom indicates that he is in all likelihood a city leader. He doesn't just live there, he's running the place. It says, when Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, my lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way. So we start to see a similar scene play out to when they came and found Abraham at the door of his tent. And they said, no, we will spend the night in the town square. They're messing with him. He knows that that is not a possibility, that there is nothing safe about them spending the night in the town square of Sodom. So look what he says in verse 3. He says, but he pressed them strongly so that they turned aside to him and entered his house. What are they doing? They're establishing his awareness of just how bad things are. It says, and he made them a feast and baked them unleavened bread, and they ate. Verse 4, but before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. Now, why is this language included? Did you hear all the alls and the everys and just the whole scope? Why? Because we are establishing the guilt of the whole place. He wants to be very clear about that. Verse 5. And they called to Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them. Anyone confused on what is meant there? They want to have sexual relations with these men. Verse 6, Lot went out to the men at the entrance, shut the door, after him and said, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Anyone bothered that he referred to them as his brothers? Do not act so wickedly. Catch the awareness that he knows there is wickedness. Verse 8, he says, Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. So we've been dancing around this issue of how women were viewed in the ancient Near East, and here it is for us. Do you know what a woman's value is? Is she a virgin? Is she beautiful? Can she have a baby? Specifically, can she have sons? So what is he doing? He is leveraging what he perceives to be a trump card, and it's his own daughters. He says, Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. Verse 9, But they said, Stand back. And they said, This fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge. Now he will deal worse with you than with them. Do you notice how quickly the bonds of brotherhood are severed as soon as their sin is pointed out? He becomes a sojourner who is unwelcome in their midst, and they turn against him. It says, Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and drew near to break the door down. But the men, the angels, reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they all went home and gave up. No, what does the text say? So that they wore themselves out groping for the door. I like to think that if I had been divinely struck blind, it would be an indication to me that it was time to go home. So once again, we're seeing these men are set on doing evil. Verse 12, Then the men said to Lot, Have you anyone else here, sons-in-laws, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Lot goes to the men who are supposed to marry his daughters, you know, the daughters he was just about to throw out into the square with that crowd. And his sons-in-law think that he is joking. Verse 15 says, As morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, Up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city. Verse 16 is heartbreaking. But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him. Now at this point, aren't you like, just leave him? What in the world? But what did God promise to Abraham? I will bless those who bless you. Why is Lot being bailed out of Sodom? Because of his relationship to Abraham. Verse 17, And as they brought them out, one said, Escape for your life, do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away. And Lot said to them, Oh, no, my lords, behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Are you catching this guy? He is bargaining that he might go to Zoar versus going into the hills. You know why? Because he sees himself more as a city boy. And if you remember back in chapter 14, we saw Zoar in a grouping of cities, one of which was Sodom and another of which was Gomorrah. Guess what Zoar is probably a lot like? And so they grant that he can go there. But you're going to notice that he doesn't end up staying there, because even he can look around and realize that God might blast that place out of the earth too, because it's just as bad. Verse 23, The sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew these cities and the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Have you thought about that story? Why does she get turned into a pillar of salt? First of all, what is indicated in her looking back over her shoulder? They've been physically dragged out of the city. And what happens? What is wrong with looking back? What is she revealing about the state of her heart when she glances in the rearview mirror? She's going to miss that place. There was something there she's sad to leave behind. And so what does God do? So we don't understand, like, why not turn her into marble, right? That would have been sufficient. But instead, a pillar of salt? Why? We think of salt as a flavoring for food. But in this time period, what was salt used for? It was a preservative. A preservative. So why is it important that Lot's wife not go to the next town and carry with her a fond memory of Sodom. Preserve in her heart a fond memory of Sodom. What does God do? He says, you want to preserve wickedness in your heart, you will become a living preservative. Everyone who looks at you will know. Don't look behind you when I deliver you from sin. Luke 17:32-33 mentions her. It says, remember Lot's wife. Whoever seeks to preserve his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life will keep it. Verse 27, and Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley, and he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. And what does he know in that moment? There were not even 10. Verse 29, so it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, he remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. What does he do? He delivers Lot for Abraham's sake. Then we get to a very distasteful part of the story where we see that not only does Lot regard his daughters as only having value for their appearance or their virginity, but that his daughters only understand their value as being able to produce offspring. Now, it's a difficult part of the story because we think, why would anyone react this way to a situation? But these are young girls who probably haven't gotten out of the house much because it sounds like to do so was not even physically safe for them. And when they see the entire habitation that they have lived in their lives destroyed by sulfur and fire, their most likely thought is, everyone is dead and we are the only ones left. And so what do? They seek to secure offspring by committing incest with their father. Now, it's a distasteful story. We need to hear it in the context that the original audience would have heard it. Because if you look at verse 37, it says, the firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. And verse 38 says, the younger also bore a son and called his name Ben-on-mi. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day. Oh, okay. So the original audience hears, so that's where those enemies came from. This unholy union. My worth lies in my ability to have children. It's a terrible, terrible lie, and unfortunately it's one that persists even into our culture today. Genesis 20. We have a story about Abraham and Abimelech, which I think when you read it, you probably thought, you've got to be kidding me, are we back here again? Because what happens? Abraham journeys toward the territory of the Negev, and he lives between Kadesh and Shur, and it says he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. Now Abimelech had not approached her. So he said, Lord, will you kill an innocent people? What is the answer? No. Verse 5, did he not himself say to me, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands I have done this. Then God said to him in the dream, do you like a chapter where God is dialoguing with the pagan instead of with the patriarch? Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore I did not let you touch her. Now then return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you and you shall live. But if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours. Verse 8, so Abimelech rose early in the morning. This is the formula we usually hear applied to Abraham. Immediate obedience. What we're seeing here is a role reversal, where the pagan is going to lecture the one who believed and it was credited to him as righteousness in what it means to be virtuous. It's nuts. Verse 8, so Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them all these things, and the men were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us, and how have I sinned against you that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you see that you did this thing? Abraham said, I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Don't miss the irony. Who is it that is demonstrating a greater fear of the Lord in this passage? Verse 12. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. Oh, well, see, now that you said it that way, we're cool. I'm sorry, it's my bad. No. He says in verse 13, and when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kindness you must do to me at every place to which we come. Say of me, he is my brother. Okay, so she is old at this point, and you're like, how is she possibly still desirous? Well, the real issue here is that she would be a good political alliance at this point. Abraham is an extremely valuable personage. He has a lot of wealth. He owns a lot of things, and everyone wants to keep him happy. But Abimelech is wise to him. And so what does he do? He does a very similar thing. He sends him away with a whole bunch of stuff, and he says, my land is open before you. You can dwell where you please. And then in verse 16, catch this ironic statement he throws out. To Sarah he said, behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone you are vindicated. Why was this an important statement for him to make? This is why this story is so much worse than the story of Abram doing this with Pharaoh. Because at this point, in all likelihood, Sarah is already pregnant. And there must be clarity about who the father is of this child. Abraham is playing fast and loose with the kindness of God. But God will jealously protect his covenant, even when we do not. So as we've seen with other righteous men, righteous Noah, who stumbled in his righteousness, for example, God shows us through Abraham that no man is righteous enough to save. If you wanted to put Abraham on a pedestal and make him equal to Christ, it cannot be done. These flawed men that we see in the Old Testament are telling us that we await a better Savior. Our hope lies solely in the righteousness of Christ. And we can rest knowing that God's covenant depends not on man's faithfulness, not on Abraham's faithfulness, not on Sarah's faithfulness, not on your faithfulness, but on the faithfulness of God alone. Is anything too hard for the Lord? No. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you are faithful to us even when we do not remain faithful to you. We thank you that you make your promises come to pass, that you breathe the ruach of your Spirit into us, and you join us to your purposes, and that though we may stumble, your purposes are sure and they will come to pass. Teach us to love righteousness and hate wickedness as you do, and to walk in the way of your statutes. And we ask these things in the name of your Son who did so perfectly. Amen.